Of the thousands of novels that are now considered classics, there are perhaps a few dozen from over the last centuries that are constantly referenced far more than any others. When you look at top 100 lists or greatest books ever published, the same names come up again and again. Now, often we have a certain cultural familiarity with these books. The stories live inside our consciousness, even if we've never read them. We have this sense of knowing what happens. Maybe that even keeps us from reading some of these books because we think, I'm already familiar with what happens in that novel or that story or that play, so I don't need to actually take the time and digest it properly. But many of these novels that are referenced again and again, because they exist in our culture and we don't read them as much, there's a gap between our familiarity and what actually happens in a lot of these books. So here are five books that you've almost certainly heard of, but you've probably never read. The first one we're going to take a look at is a bit of a shorter one. Now, this is a classic of American literature. This is a book that everyone's heard the name, but yet not very many people have actually taken the time to digest this book. And this one is, of course, Huckleberry Finn, or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Now, Twain is a fantastic humorist and satirist, hilarious. His essays are almost as great as his writings, and his writings are substantial. This is a contender for the great American novel. It's truly one of the novels that most influenced history. Everybody's heard the name, people make references to it, and but it's not read as widely as you would think, maybe outside of college or high school. And I think part of the reason for that is a lot of people associate this book with an old novel that is no longer perhaps relevant, or they already feel they know the story. That's the other component that is a big thing with Huck Finn. Now, Twain's great novels, Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. Huck Finn is substantially better. Tom Sawyer is absolutely worth reading, but Huck Finn is really one of those novels that has a deep moral core. And it's been maligned as well by various people recently. I think often misunderstanding what Twain was doing at the time when he was writing it. And it's certainly a product of its time, like any novel, of course, that goes without saying. But The Adventures of Huck Finn is absolutely an essential read, and it's one novel very commonly people reference, they've heard of, and yet they haven't read it. So another one here, moving over to England. This is a much older work, can't properly be considered a novel. So there's a reason I said top five books, because I'm not just including novels, I'm including because that's a relatively recent art form. Before you had the novel, epic poetry was perhaps the most common, or just collections of poetry and plays. And so this is one of the greatest poems in the English language. Um, Protestant theology was deeply affected by this work alone. A very heterodox thinker, ironically, and our images of the world, it's so influenced by his writing. This epic poem is Paradise Lost by John Milton. Now, next to Shakespeare, Milton is probably the most famous and influential British writer, uh, at least of the last 500 years. And I think that Paradise Lost is an essential read. Paradise Regained, which is his sequel, you could read it. It's Milton, so it's still worth, reading in that level. But the reason Paradise Lost is so essential is because it takes a look at the story of the fall in the garden at the beginning of the Bible. And it almost defines the way we see the story today. If you read the original, you're going to find that, it didn't go quite the way that you remembered it, right? And that's probably because the way you remembered it, if you just grew up secular or if you just kind of live in the culture and you didn't read this so much, you remember that story more the way that Milton actually wrote it. And he kind of makes Satan, makes the devil this character you can kind of empathize with. The famous line, "It's better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven," comes from this work here. So Paradise Lost is another classic work, absolutely worth reading. Everyone's probably heard it, or at least heard the name, or at least even if they haven't heard of the book, they've they are living with concepts or frameworks of the world that were directly influenced by this work. So it's absolutely essential reading. A third one here is a novel. So we're going to go back to that. This novel is, another really famous one. Everyone's heard the name. How many people have actually read it? People know kind of some of the characters even better than they know the plot of the story. One character in particular, we'll get to. And this novel is Jane Eyre. Now, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Uh, it's classic. But Jane Eyre is interesting because, well, I want to say a couple biographical things about Charlotte Bronte. So she had two sisters who are also fantastic writers in England. Her sister Emily wrote Wuthering Heights, and Anne wrote The Tenant at Wildfell Hall, which are all classics in their own respect. But of those three, you could make a case for Wuthering Heights as a great novel. I think Jane Eyre is far and away the most interesting and, in my experience, most enjoyable novel to have read. The famous character from Jane Eyre that I was referencing before is Bertha, who is the wife or the former wife, the first wife in the attic. You probably heard the kind of stereotype or that what would be the word I'm looking for? The symbol of the crazy woman in the attic. Well, that comes from this. And there are a lot of modern works of literature that have repurposed that and kind of looked at how we can empathize more with Bertha and not see her so much as an antagonist, which she's more portrayed as in the novel. But I think actually the novel is more complex than that. And it's not a pastiche, right? It's not just about Bertha. I mean, Jane Eyre is really a gothic coming of age novel, and that's the coolest thing about it. I mean, I love the gothic era, and I think we have that kind of image in our minds of the gothic era because I mean, to a certain extent, Pride and Prejudice could fall into that as well. Certainly, Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre and a lot of the novels that you think of when you think of like the movie, the TV Victorian style novels. Um, uh, that's very much what this book is. And so, if you want to really go into that world and see the psychological side of it, and Bertha's also an interesting kind of foil to that world, to that repressed Victorian way of living, the kind of unleashed crazy person that must necessarily live underneath the surface. You see this a lot as well in contemporary Japanese literature, which has a lot of suppression in certain components. So maybe we'll talk about some of those novels in the future, but Jane Eyre, absolutely. Now this one, I don't know if we can properly consider this one work because this is a collection of works. I was going to choose one, but I decided to choose the full collection because this writer is a very special individual, and there are certain writers that you can't even really divide their works because everything is classic. Now, there is no writer, perhaps except unless you consider the entire corpus of the Bible as a writer's, that is more classic than this one right here, and it is, of course, William Shakespeare, the complete works of William Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare has several plays, several sonnets, a poem that are all considered classics. His plays are obviously the most classic, although some of his sonnets, to be honest, can even get to that threshold in terms of just how much of a literary giant he is. Pretty much all modern writing is built in reference to Shakespeare. I think that is the real reason why he is such a classic. But everyone's heard of Shakespeare. Everyone knows who Shakespeare is. Everyone's probably heard of Romeo and Juliet, I imagine. That's the one that's most common. Macbeth and Hamlet, perhaps, are other ones that a lot of people have heard of. But all of the works of Shakespeare live in our modern world because we experience the world through the stories that have informed our way of thinking. And if you live in the West, if you live in an English-speaking country, even if you've never read Shakespeare, you know who he is, right? Everyone's heard of Shakespeare. And most people have read something from Shakespeare, maybe a high school play, something very briefly. Few people sit down, open up, complete works of William Shakespeare and read like Henry the Fourth, for example. Very few people have done that. Um, and very few people are gonna sit down and even read Hamlet or Macbeth or King Lear or The Tempest or The, you know, Midsummer Night's Dream, Twelfth Night, some of these really classic plays that everyone's heard of, you're more likely maybe to watch it, a film adaptation. But to actually read Shakespeare is truly an experience that will change your mind because his way of writing is Harold Bloom described it as in one of his books, the creation of the modern human. Basically, before there was psychology, there had to be a precursor, and I think you can make a very strong argument that Shakespeare was one of the biggest precursors to the psychologizing, the way of looking at our minds that we kind of take for granted today. Because before that, that just wasn't the way people thought uh, cross-culturally, right? You go to different way. There's just different ways of thinking, and Shakespeare really got into that idea of, particularly if you read Hamlet, I think it's the most essential read in my opinion. King Lear is also a contender for that argument, and maybe as I get older, I feel myself leaning more and more to King Lear as the great work. But Hamlet is the essential read for an existentially minded person. So many lines from it, words, to be or not to be, so many things like these existential questions, and that ultimately, the to be or to not to be question, as an example, is kind of the one of the deepest questions of philosophy when you really look at it from a literary perspective. And so anything Shakespeare, Hamlet, King Lear, Macbeth, Midsummer Night's Dream, Twelfth Night to The Tempest, all of his sonnets, absolutely essential reading. All right, now the last one. This is not a play, it is not a novel, and it's not an epic poem. So why did I choose a book that is none of those three? Because I wanted something that was representative of another very important branch of literature, which is poetry. And I think poetry, modern poetry in particular, uh, transcendental poetry, poetry that really expresses the human soul, the human longing for a connection to something deeper, to something divine. Now, poetry is another thing. A lot of people have heard of great poems. They've heard of Robert Frost. They've heard of William Wordsworth. They've heard of so many great poets. Emily Dickinson. You've probably heard of, I mean, Shakespeare as a poet as well. You've probably heard of uh, a lot of modern contemporary poets that you would have heard of would have based themselves on these earlier writers. Now, when it comes to American poetry, there's perhaps no more essential writer than the writer of this, and that is Walt Whitman. Now, Walt Whitman is uh, he is unique, and this work, Leaves of Grass, is his most essential work, in my opinion. Everyone's heard of Walt Whitman, or many people have heard of Walt Whitman. Many people have heard of Leaves of Grass, but even if you've never heard of Leaves of Grass, you've heard of Whitman, and if you've never heard of Whitman, you've heard Whitman. That's the thing. Some of these great writers, you might not have heard of them, but their works are so influential, so present in our culture that we know these writers even without knowing who they are. If you ever saw Dead Poets Society, this guy, right? If you ever saw, um, there's so many modern movies. I'm failing to remember it right off the top of my head what some of them are that use to be a sailor of the world bound to all ports or Captain My Captain or a lot of these great Walt Whitman ideas. And I think that's what makes Leaves of Grass essential and worth reading, even though a lot of people uh, haven't read it, even though you've heard it. Now that's a lot. There's a whole stack here, and I was just looking at that before and thinking half of those could also have been included in this. So there are many books that are considered classics, and yet very few people have read them. But hopefully those five that we looked at today inspire something for you guys and maybe some interest in some of these amazing books to look a little bit deeper. All right, guys, God bless. Have a great rest of your day.